let me start with by saying like I'm a huge fan of the book.
Thank you.
Which I've read probably a couple of times at this stage. To start with a level set, what is culture? How is that different from values and virtues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I always like to start with where the ancient samurai started, which is a culture is not a set of beliefs, it's a set of actions. And which is why I call the book What You Do Is Who You Are, because, you know, what you believe is not who you are, what's in your heart is not who you are, what you tweet is not who you are, the values you put on your wall is not who you are, it's what you do every day. It's how you treat each other, it's how you show up, it's do you show up on time, it's, you know, do you do a deal for the price or the partnership, it's do you return a call that day or the next day or never, are you responsive to your colleagues or not, or only if somebody's looking. Like all those things define the culture of the company, and those are the every single day behaviors. And the thing that I think, the reason I wrote the book is if you look at the management literature, it's all about the mission statement, the OKRs, the KPIs, the objectives, but you know, none of that's in any of that. The culture is not captured in the goals. The culture is the daily process of how you accomplish the goals and these behaviors. So, you know, it is tricky to manage with the conventional techniques. And it's always funny because, you know, I talk to companies that are like, oh yeah, we had an offsite and we got all these values. And I'm like, okay, you're going to have a culture of hypocrisy because I'm sure you're not going to follow them. Well, how are you going to, you know, implement them? And they'll say, oh, well, you know, we put in people's annual performance review whether they follow the values. Well, you didn't even know if they got the phone call. How do you know if they returned the phone call or when they returned the phone call? That's not how you move culture through an annual performance review. Like this is a daily thing. People have to face it daily. It's got to, you know, you have to interact with it. And so it's a very different set of techniques than, you know, KPIs and OKRs and mission statements and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Not that those aren't good. They're good. You should have them in your company. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying culture is a different thing.
Yeah. How do you know if you have a culture that's failing? Is that...
Yeah.
And a related question is Uber or maybe WeWork, like are those cultures that are examples of culture that fail or cultural failures?
Well, let me say this, like there's not a company in the world that's got total cultural cohesion where everybody behaves the way you'd like them to at all times. That just doesn't exist. Nobody gets close to that. But you can get to, you know, good enough, you know, better, you know, not having a fatal flaw. I think, you know, Uber had a very compelling culture under Travis with a very bad issue. And I can get into that, but when you get into like, how do you know it's not working? I think the little thing that tells you is when people's behavior really surprises you, and you're like, wow, I didn't think we had, I can't believe that person's running around taking credit for that person's work or lying all the time, or you're going like, you know, what's going on? Those are signs. There's actually an example I have in the book, and I want to be careful about this because when I talk about it with not enough context, people don't know what I'm talking about. But one of the things that I go through in the book, I go through leaders and people who define culture in different contexts. And one of the contexts is by a friend of mine, Shaka Senghor, who built a culture in prison, you know, as a leader of a gang called the Milanics. And the reason I use those examples, and I'm comparing, you know, some people, oh, you're comparing prison and business. Like, what are you doing? You're an asshole. And I'm comparing leadership and leadership. And I'm comparing organizational dynamics and organizational dynamics. And he's a like super insightful leader, so that's where I took that from. But he told me a story that really helped me understand how culture works a lot. So when he went to prison for murder when he was 19 years old. And his first day in, he and 6 other guys come out of quarantine. And the very first thing that happens is, you know, while they're in the rec area, is a prisoner walks up to another prisoner and stabs him in the neck. And then he pulls out the shank, throws it in the trash, and walks to the chow hall and has a sandwich. And Shaka's telling me the story, and he's like, so we're looking at each other like, where the fuck are we at? Like, this is different. And he said, and I had to ask myself, could I do that? And in the way I wrote the book, I should say, like, he and I are friends, so like we're in the backyard. I'm like, what do you mean you had to ask yourself, could you do that? You were in for murder. You did that, didn't you? It's just right. And he's like, no. He said, what happened to me is, I've been on the street since I was 14 years old. I had been shot like 18 months earlier, so I had PTSD from getting shot. I was always paranoid. And I'm in a drug deal, and these guys come up. There was supposed to be one guy in the car. There's two guys in the car. And the guy in the back of the car was very belligerent. He was supposed to stay in the car. He gets out of the car. I had a gun in my pocket. I reacted and I shot him. That's what I did. He said, this guy spent weeks fashioning a 2-liter bottle into a weapon and then decided, am I going to stab this guy in the stomach and wound him, or am I going to stab him in the neck and kill him? And then stabs him in the neck and kills him and keeps walking and has a sandwich. He said, there's no way I could do that, but I had to ask myself, could I do that? Because that's what it was going to take to survive here. And I see it immediately. Oh, that set is culture. That's how that violence in prison gets set, with that cultural thing, looking at the person who's succeeding and seeing their behavior. And so when you look at your company, you can't say, okay, people are going to behave according to the values on the wall. They're going to go, oh, that person who just got promoted, lobbied the CEO for 6 months, took credit for her work, did those things. That's your culture. That's how that gets set. Because when I'm coming in, that's what I have to do to succeed in your company. And so when you think about how is your company failing, you have to ask yourself, well, what is it like for a new employee here? Like, what are they experience? What's their experience of the environment? It's a complex dynamic, but and one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did is you kind of have to understand holistically how does a culture move, and then you can recognize it and make corrections and learn to program it and that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's a fascinating story. Maybe for the entrepreneurs in the room, like how do you originally, you start a company, how do you set the culture? I think you quote Patrick Alderson, one of the co-founders of Stripe, as in saying that the first 20 people are the people that set the culture. Is that how that works?
Yeah, so I think he's not quite right about that. He grew Stripe so slowly that that comes into play. Look, I do think it's very influential because people, as I said, people try to adopt the working habits of the people that are there. But as you grow fast and as you bring in leaders from different cultures and different companies, they're going to start to modify it, and things are going to start to change and evolve. And so you have to do things that are stronger than just, okay, I hired 20 people who I think I like and I think are going to behave the way that I want them to, and everybody's going to follow that. That's not actually strong enough. I give you an example of something we did at Andreessen Horowitz. So I had the problem going in of, I wanted, and every VC says this, I wanted us to respect entrepreneurs. I wanted us to respect how hard it was to build a company and have the whole firm feel like that. Okay, we know what you're doing. We know what it's about. Every VC says this. How many VCs show up to meetings on time with entrepreneurs? How many VCs actually get back to you if they're not investing in the deal and tell you why? Like, it's very disrespectful to go present all your work to somebody and then have them ghost you when you're trying to find out what's going on, right? And so how do you get from we respect entrepreneurs to that kind of behavior? And the thing is, you're fighting as a VC this dynamic that is basically, I have the money. You as an entrepreneur want the money. You have to come see me to get the money, and then I get to decide. So that makes me feel like a big person, and you're the little person. And that's an attitude that a lot of these VCs walk around with. It's just very pervasive in the business. So I was determined, okay, how do we set the culture so that doesn't happen? And so one of the first rules I put in place is, if you're late to a meeting with an entrepreneur, $10 a minute fine. So you had to go to the bathroom, no problem, you owe me $50 right now. You had a really important phone call to make, great, you owe me $100. And the thing about that idea is we have lots of meetings with entrepreneurs, and every time somebody would pay me money, they're like, Ben, like, why am I paying you to work here? This is like, I had to go to the bathroom. You know, and you're charging me, and they're like, and that's not like, I took 3 meetings in a row. What do you? And I'm like, look, you have to plan when you're going to go to the bathroom, because you have to understand how hard these guys are working and how much stress they're under. And you have to show up on time, like, okay, like they put the time in, we're putting the time in. And don't tell me you can't do it, because if you were getting married, like, I know you wouldn't have to go to the bathroom when you were supposed to be at the altar. You would have planned that shit. And so I know you, but it's that mechanic where they have to ask themselves, why? Why am I planning when to go to the bathroom? Because it's not something that you would ordinarily do in business. Like, why am I planning that? Oh, I'm planning that because building a company is really hard. And I need to know that, and we need to show that, and that's what we're going to be about. And so and I call that that type of rule a shocking rule, which is a rule that you have that everybody wants to know, why do we have that rule? I wasn't expecting that rule. I wasn't expecting to pay to go to a meeting, but that's why we have it. And if people have to ask themselves that, then that drives home the message and kind of enforces the culture in that dimension.
And how do you think about the trade-off of enforcing something like this, either at Andreessen or Horowitz or in companies that you work with? You know, typically the high performer who's not turns out to not be a cultural fit. Is that somebody that you fire because of culture, or do you keep them? How do you make it work?
One, I think you have to ask people to play in the culture, particularly, and look, it's not going to be across everything. So if you start out and you say, okay, we have, and I call them virtues, not values, from the samurai, because I'm concerned with the behaviors, not the ideas. But like, not everybody's going to have every virtue that you want them to have in life. It's just that the people are people; they're messed up. So you have to say, okay, well, what are the things that I gots to have? And that, like, I'm going to have zero tolerance for anybody not doing. And I'll fine Andreessen if he's late for a meeting. So, like, I have no tolerance on that one because it's such a core value of ours. But there are other things where, like, people may have they're just coming from such a different place, and they're such a high performer, and it's not a core value that's critical to the strategic position of your business, where maybe that isn't the most important thing. And I think companies end up having subcultures as a result of that. And so I'll give you a really interesting example on subcultures. So do you remember the Amazon article in the New York Times where they basically said Amazon's like the worst place to work in the world? It's like hell on earth. And all of us in tech were going, wait a minute, Amazon is known for like the best culture in the world. They do all these things. I said it, Bezos is meticulous, and they even, like, they come to the meeting with their little, like, whatever 3-page memo, and they all have to read it before the meeting, and everybody's got that culture of you really have to think through your ideas and all that kind of thing. So how could they have the worst culture when we all think they have the best culture? It really, like, kind of messed me up. And at first I thought, okay, fake news, Donald Trump, whatever, like they're just doing a hit piece on Amazon. But I know that writer. In fact, he did a piece on me, and he's one of the most earnest writers. David Streitfeld. This guy is like a real, like, he's the kind of journalist where you go, okay, like, even if you don't like journalism, you have to have respect for what he does. So I knew he didn't make it up. And I talked to, when I was writing the book, I talked to a bunch of the Amazon executives about it, and they said, it wasn't entirely right, in that most people love working for Amazon. Tech workers love working for Amazon. They love it. It's great. The culture is great. There's no complaints on that end. But what we didn't realize until that article came out is, we had hired so many people from retail, from Nordstrom, from Macy's, from, Neiman Marcus. And they're like, well, we got to work 12-hour days. We got to prepare like this for a meeting. Like, what the fuck? Like, I ain't going to retail to do this. This isn't the life I signed up for. I'm in tears, man. Like, and so they actually started to create a subculture, a different part of the culture, for people coming from that environment, because it just wasn't going to work. They're not paying them that kind of money to do that kind of thing. They're not having those kind of careers. They're interested in other things in life. And so, and I think that that's a component in every company. And it was when we, at Slack, kind of they started up as bottoms-up SaaS and then, had to put in the Salesforce. And I remember I spent a lot of time talking to Stuart about it. I was like, Stuart, we have to pay commissions. We're not, this is sales. It's a prize fight. No prize, no fight. I was just getting it's going to be a different culture. But when I went to talk to the sales team, when we got the original people in, one of the first thing I said to them was like, look, I don't care what the general culture is at Slack. You can't come to work at 10 a.m. in your pajamas. You got to have a clean shirt and you got to show up at 8. You got to get on the phone. You got to call the customers. You got to do that thing. You're going to have different elements here as a salesperson. And so, yeah, it's not going to be uniform all the time.
Mm-hmm. Just something that's not in the book. Maybe from your experience of investing, what have you seen in terms of companies that scale globally and actually have literally different cultures from different countries? Yeah. How do you include those?
Yeah, so I think what it comes down to is what things, and when you think about the culture, it's like, what do you need to have that's universal? And to me, the things that have to be universal are the things that support the business strategy. And, which is why, for us, I don't care where you work at Andreessen Horowitz, if you don't respect entrepreneurs, you are defeating our whole brand, our whole message, our whole positioning in the market so I gotta have that. But there aren't that many things like that I have to have. It's a handful. Whereas, I think there's kind of a lot of unstated parts of a culture that you're never going to state, and some of those will be different. If you're in Spain, people are going to take big lunches. You can't stop them; they love it. Siesta, the whole thing. I mean, it's crazy. Drink at lunch. I had a hard time adjusting to that culture when I spent time there. But but that's not anybody's business strategy to not have a big lunch, right? That's just kind of how you do things in your place or whatever. Some places everybody eats lunch at their desk, and that's the culture. But it's not an important part of the culture. It's just that's just how it went, and so you don't have to try to enforce that internationally. But there are going to be things that define who you are as a company and what you're like to do business with. For example, just if you have a thing where, okay, if somebody, we are responsive to each other. If somebody asks me for something in the company, I'm going to tell them yes or no, or I'm going to get back to them. I'm not going to just leave it in my email box and they're a lower rank than me, so I'm not going to respond because we're hierarchical like that. If that's part of your culture, I don't care if you're in France, you have to still do that. And so it's that kind of, it's a subset of the totality of what the culture is. Mm-hmm.
How do you create an inclusive culture, particularly with respect to, gender, minorities?
Yeah. So I learned a lot. I think that in general in tech, people do it. They're almost destructive with how they try to do inclusion. And let me explain why. So, and I learned a lot of this. Is something I spent a lot of time on, and I learned a lot on. But the breakthrough for me was a conversation I had with a friend of mine, Steve Stout, who's been in the paper a little bit for the Knicks. For those of you who are Knicks fans, he's doing work with the Knicks and causing trouble there. But he's a kind of boisterous type, charismatic personality. He called me up one day. He goes, Ben, I used to be president of Sony Urban Music. And I already knew that, I'd known Steve for years, but I knew he was saying that to me for a reason. He wanted to tell me something else. And I go, yeah, Steve, I know you were president of Sony Urban Music. He's like, yeah, but it wasn't Sony Urban Music. It was Sony Black Music, but they wouldn't let us call it Black Music because that would be racist, so we had to call it Urban Music. And I said, well, that's silly. And he said, no, that wasn't what's silly. What's silly is because they called it urban music, they didn't let me market in rural areas. I was only allowed to market in cities. There's no black people who live in rural areas. And I was like, wow, that's so stupid. And he said, you're not even listening to me, Ben. I was president of Sony Urban Music. I had Michael Jackson. But white people don't like Michael Jackson. It wasn't fucking black music, it was music. What are they talking about? It was music. And they put me in this category. And, it didn't make any sense at all. And, it struck me. I was like, oh, shit. Like, that's what we do in Silicon Valley. Urban talent. Like, it's not urban talent. It's not black talent, women talent, Hispanic talent. It's talent. And if you don't know that, it's because you can't see the talent, just like they couldn't hear the music. And then if you look at the epilogue on Sony Urban Music, okay, once streaming came out, guess what? The urban music department, the black section of Tower Records went away, the radio station segregation went away, all that stuff that they had built, the whole infrastructure to help market black music went away. And go look at Spotify. 92 of the top 100 songs are black music. It wasn't black music, it was music. And just because some executives couldn't hear it, they cut off most of their market. And that's what we're doing on the talent market. And so I'm going to take it all the way down. So I'm early in the firm when we have this conversation. And we have just what a lot of you who have companies have. So you have a woman running that department, guess who's working there? A lot of women. You have a white man running that department, guess who's working there? A lot of white men. You have an Asian person running that, why is that? Well, I know what I'm good at. I value it highly, and I can test for it in an interview. I can see me, and so that's what I'm hiring. I'm hiring me, more of me, because that's what I can see. And so I had Frank Chen, and he had all Asian people working for him. I had Margaret Wenmakers running marketing. She had all women working for her. And so I'm like, I'm going to crack the code on this thing. So I go to Margaret, and I'm like, Margaret, what is in your hiring profile, in your job criteria, where no men can get a job working for you? And she looked at me, and she said, helpfulness. I was like, oh boy.
Ouch.
I don't know a lot of helpful men. But let me tell you how stupid I was and how blind to talent I was when she told me that. We're a venture capital firm. We're a services firm. We're in the business of helping entrepreneurs. That is our business, helpfulness, anticipating a need before you ask for it, making sure you get what you need. No other job profile in the entire company outside of her organization had helpfulness. She was the only one who had it. So here's this criteria that's material to our business that we don't even know is a criteria. That's how dumb we were. And so, look, we corrected it. And, just doing that, we're 180 people, we're 52% women. We have 7 women general partners, something like that, whatever. But we don't have a head of diversity. We don't have a program. We just have criteria that's wide, where we can see talent that we ourselves might not have. I give you a second example on this because you mentioned the Cultural Leadership Fund. So we had a position early in the firm where we wanted it to be, if you were with another venture capital firm and we liked your company, we wanted to be able to do more for you than those guys. So we wanted a person who would go around, meet CEOs that we weren't invested in, and connect them to the firm, and we could help them find talent and all these kinds of things. So the person hiring for that position was an investment banker. And so everybody who I saw in the interview process was an investment banker, all investment bankers. And so, okay, so I go to him, I'm like, hey, what is the job profile for this thing? And he's like, well, they have to be, great at follow-up. They have to be really smart, detail-oriented, all the things investment bankers had. And I was like, okay, great. But isn't the main criteria for this job is to be able to build a relationship with somebody who has no business reason to do so, a great relationship person? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, who likes investment bankers? And he goes oh, wow, that's crazy. Yeah, so what do you want me to do? I said, well, think about the kind of talent pools we can draw from. What culture do you know of that's very relationship oriented, where the relationship is where it starts. That's the center of the activity. That's the jump off point. He goes, I have no idea. I was like, well, look, I'm not even going to tell you how to do your job, but in my experience, if you grow up in an African-American family, like your parents will teach you how to talk to people when you're young. Like that's how much focus there is on relationships. Like everything starts with the relationship there. So that might be a good talent pool to look at. And he says, well, do you want me to hire a black person? I was like, fuck no, I didn't say that. Like I don't want you to hire, I want you to hire on the right criteria. And I'm saying that talent pool, like you may be able to find somebody in that talent pool that you wouldn't even know could come into venture capital that could do that. And so we ended up hiring a guy who was previously a sound engineer for Jermaine Dupri. So then the reason I bring that up in Atlanta is, people go, there's not enough pipeline. It's like, well, there's not enough pipeline if you don't know what the fuck you're looking for. But like for that, there's tons of pipeline. And so this guy, so we hire him, his name's Chris Lyons. And after we hire him, and this is talent blind thing, I find out he used to work at the Cheesecake Factory. So the Cheesecake Factory measures every waiter by the percentage of tips against bill. He's the number one waiter nationwide. He's like the best instant relationship person in the world. And today, if anybody knows him, he's the best relationship person in venture capital, no question. He's the best. And why is that important is because we hired him on that criteria. We didn't hire him on our regular venture capital criteria. So if you hire somebody on race and gender through the urban talent department instead of through the normal talent department, through the fucking side door instead of through the front door, because you can't see the talent, then you're never going to be good at inclusion. So you have to start with understanding people and understanding people who don't have talent that you don't have. Helpfulness is you know how hard it is to know what somebody wants before they even say anything? That's a real talent and skill. That's a real fucking tangible thing that's real, and you have to be able to recognize it if you're going to get it and get that competitive advantage. You can't just go, I'm hiring a woman, which is what people in Silicon Valley do, and it's why they get it all screwed up. And then you go into these companies and you look at attrition, employee sat, and so forth, and it segments by race and gender. That's the metric. Employee satisfaction, promotion, is that equal? Not coming in the door. Coming in the door, yeah, you can fake that by doing the dumbest thing in the world by creating the urban talent department. So I got too excited about it. I'm sorry. I went off that's the longest answer to a question ever, but that's it. Sorry.
Maybe one last question from me, because I want to open it up to people. As a venture capital investor, how much do you both factor culture before you invest? How do you test for it? How do you get a sense for what kind of culture you're investing in? And then as you become a board member, to which extent is it your role to be the helper, the guardian of a specific type of culture?
I think it's funny. So once I wrote the book, people are like, "Whoa! So you evaluate all companies based on culture?" And then people in my company, "Well, it's, are you sure you want to do that culturally?" And this and that. I'm not a magic person. I don't can't anticipate the culture of a company with that comes to me with two entrepreneurs and what they're going to have. So there's not that much to evaluate when they start. And I don't think day one you try to set the culture of a company. I think that you don't know enough. You have to kind of learn. Okay, what works? What makes us a good place to work? What makes us a good company to do business with? What do we need in the culture that supports the strategy? And then you develop it over time. So there's not that much to evaluate when when Databricks came to me. I invested the day they incorporated the company, and so they didn't have any culture, they didn't have any company, they didn't have any workspace or anything. But having said that, I think that if you have a founder who's say telling you some pretty aggressive, not true things in the pitch, then that's going to be a tricky founder to work for, because it's very rare to have a person who lies only to investors and not to their employees and that kind of thing. So that tends to be one that kind of is it goes everywhere that person goes. So you have to be mindful of you don't want to. You have to invest in people who you think have the leadership skills to build a culture. But I wouldn't know how to like walk into a new company and evaluate what their culture is going to be.
Mm-hmm. And as you were saying, like, one of the
Yeah.
key or interesting things in the book is that there's not one culture that wins, right? Different cultures. What worked for Amazon didn't work for Apple, I think you.
Yeah, no, right. So one of the things I point out in the book is, look, Amazon was famous for its frugality. Frugality, like when the first employees came in, your desk was a door with 2x4s holding it up and that kind of thing. So like, we're not even going to buy a desk. Like, we're going to get an old door and put it up because that's how much we want to save money. But that was very key to their strategy, because the Amazon strategy, if you guys remember his original chart, was to be the low price leader in everything, because that way, as a consumer, you wouldn't have to price compare. You just know you could get it at the best price at Amazon. And that meant that you had to really control costs if you were going to do that. It was integral to the overall strategy of being the everything store. Apple, so you could say, oh, frugality worked for Amazon, I'm going to do it. But like, Apple doesn't have that value, and nor should they, or nor can they, because their strategy is to have the best, most beautiful tools in the world for their customers. And so they spare no expense. In fact, Steve Jobs got fired originally for sparing no expense. So that was exactly what got him fired from Apple in the beginning. But that was, in their campus, if you've been to their campus, it's like a $5 billion campus. The doorknobs cost like $8,000 each. So that's not the right value for them. And Apple will probably always build more beautiful products on Amazon, and Amazon's products will always cost less, and that's fine. You can have, two different cultures. So I always say, whatever your culture is should support your business strategy. It shouldn't be what you borrowed from Jeff Bezos, because he built a different company than you're building.
All right, questions?
Can you hear me? Okay. Can you quickly comment on the quantification of culture and in the emerging space of HR analytics?
Yes. Look, I think it all depends on the virtue, the behavior that you're trying to drive. So I don't... there are things you can measure. So like, for example, we do a customer satisfaction survey of entrepreneurs we rejected, to measure whether we treated them with, because that's kind of, to me, the litmus test of, are you treating people with respect? How would they recommend us even though we didn't do the deal? Did we get back to them? Did we give them a clear reason why we weren't investing, all that kind of thing? And so we have, numbers around that. We have, kind of other things in the firm that are trickier to put a metric on. So one of them is, one virtue that we have is we support not trash dreams. And because we believe, every entrepreneurial idea is a dream. And so there's not a metric, there's not a carrot on that one, there's a stick, which is, one of the things I tell everybody at New Employee Orientation is, if you get on Twitter, like some VCs, and start shitting all over somebody's company, saying, oh, they'll never make any money, that's a dumb idea, I can't believe they called it bodega. You know how these VCs are, some of you remember that company. Then, you're fired. And I don't care how bad the idea is. If your idea is to, spit on somebody's dream to make yourself look like you're a smarty pants, then, you can't work here, because that's not who... Other people can do that, but you can't do that and work at this firm. But that's not really going to be a metric. That's you do not do that under any circumstance. You might as well shoot somebody in the head, because you're gone. And so I don't think it's it's not an objective. Is the thing I would say about culture. It's a process, and it's the time you spend on your way to the objective, which, by the way, is most of your time. And it's going to be the thing that people kind of value most about their time at your company when they're no longer there. And so it's that kind of a thing.
Hi, Ben. I was wondering if I know we've been talking about corporate culture and culture in VC firms and so forth. I was wondering if you could comment on how culture develops in cities, for example, like the tech scene in Silicon Valley versus New York versus Denver, Austin, et cetera. Like, how do we think about those? How do they develop? How do we create those types of different cultures as time goes on?
And it is the same kind of thing, which is it's kind of adoption of the behaviors that work or are cool or make you the friends that you want to make, and which is the same thing in a company. I think the big difference is a company's got a CEO who has like special powers, can fire people and reprimand them and so forth, whereas in the broader culture, it doesn't work that way. But actually, one of the reasons we started the Cultural Leadership Fund is we wanted a partnership with people who knew how to move culture in the general sense. And if you look at the LPs in that fund, Quincy Jones, P. Diddy, Kevin Durant, so forth, they're all people who have a kind of genius ability to do that. And I would just say it's very different. I wouldn't presume, like I'm not, I'm not a real expert on how to move culture in the broader society. Which is why we have the partnership, because I think it is important. Like if you're trying to change consumer behavior or something like that, and understanding of how culture moves is critical. But it's a good question. But it is the same thing. It's just different. And the Samurai was also, I have a section in the book on Samurai. Was an interesting one because they had developed. It was a broad society. It wasn't a hierarchy, but they developed a code that sort of dictated the culture for the society.
Jumping off the woman's point there, as an employee looking at startups or other businesses, how would you say one would assess the culture of that company, given the obvious information asymmetries where they're going to paint the rosiest picture they can? How do you see the truth between that?
Yeah, so what I always found is if you ask specific questions about little things, because culture is driven by very little things. So if you say, so what is it like to work here? Like if I send an email to, somebody asking a question, like will they answer it, or how fast will they answer it, or what'll it be like, or, people like in meetings, just like everybody on their computer and phone, are you guys talking, or do people show up on time? Like nobody's going to lie about that. If you say, is this a good culture? Nobody's going to say that the culture is bad if they're trying to hire you. So you kind of have to get into specific behaviors that you might think are indicative or that you have experienced in a bad culture, and just see if they have those there. It would be the way I would approach that.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about the Bushido Code and how one of the key virtues is brutal honesty or sincere honesty.
Mm-hmm.
How do you integrate that into a culture when you're trying to manage down and also manage up, particularly in the age of sensitivity?
In the age of sensitivity, yeah. Mm. I don't do well. You hear all of my profanity that I've already used. Oh, gosh. So, I think the biggest thing to overcome on honesty is sort of, there's two things. One is bad news, and particularly if you're in a leadership position, it's very important that bad news travels fast, which is an old router protocol kind of truism. But you need bad news to get to you, and it's very tricky because nobody wants to be associated with the bad news. That's kind of thing. Like I'm bringing a problem, I'm not bringing a solution, or like all this person does is just bring me problems. So people hesitate to get bad news to travel. The way I did it when I was CEO was I used to make it a requirement. I would say, look, I know there's things broken in the company now. We're, many hundreds of employees. I know there's stuff going wrong, so I want to know what it is. And for you to come to my staff meeting, you have to tell me something bad. And so that just desensitized people to bringing bad news because we just did it all the time and we just talk about it and we deal with it or choose not to deal with it. But from priorities. The other kind of thing, and I have a piece on this that's probably more well thought through in my first book, Hard Things about giving feedback. But like one of the big things on giving feedback on improving is just people getting used to, if you wait once a year and say, you know what, like your presentation skills are garbage, then that's going to hurt somebody to their core, right? But if every time you see something, you go, you know, like the narrative's not there, you know, let's work on the story or whatever, and you give feedback on a more frequent basis, then people can absorb it easy because they know it's not, you know, they see you do it with everybody, they know it's not an attack on them personally. But if you like save it up and whop them with it, then people do get sensitive because they're working hard. It's like, man, I'm working so hard, and the first thing you say to me is like my presentation skills are garbage. Like, what about all the things I'm doing right? You didn't notice any of that? So you just have to kind of, you know, it's a sort of just catch people doing the things they're doing right and wrong on a very frequent basis if you're in that kind of thing, and give people feedback all the time is the best way to deal with that.
All right, wonderful. All right, so a couple of things before we clap and thank Ben for this amazing discussion, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Ben. This was incredible.
Oh,
Really
thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much.